The whole etude is an exercise in arpeggios, right? So if you broke that down into different blocks, different groups, you'd end up with just a few chords stacked on top of each other. There's a few ways to go about it. You could either block it into sections within one range of the piano, so right in one octave. Or you could go up and down the piano, the compass of the piano with the same chords stacked on top of each other, which is how the etude ends up working out when you perform it, like this. And again, as long as you know the order of the notes that they happen within that progression, you can quickly learn a whole section. Thanks for clicking on this video. Today I want to focus a little bit more on memorization. I'm making another learning video, to be a part of a big playlist. That's my plan, a big playlist of teaching videos that cover various topics, but various important topics that we cover a lot in piano pedagogy or in organ performance, piano performance, keyboard instruments in general. And these techniques are going to apply to instruments in general as well. If you're a clarinetist, if you're a trombone player, you're going to find yourself using some of these techniques too. The idea behind memorization is that you can't totally rely on muscle memory. That is, you can't just rely on the sensation, how it feels under your hands, to go off of an entire piece, to have everything just sealed away in your memory by how things feel. If you do that, you're going to end up on stage, the adrenaline will start pumping, and suddenly your hands being shakier than they normally are, you generally feeling less physically confident than you normally do during practice. It's going to totally mess up your ability to feel where your hands belong on the piano. So I'm going to introduce you to a few different tips I have for memorizing away from your hands, maybe using the score or just the piano visually, techniques other than muscle memory for the sake of solidifying memorization, for the sake of having a more confident performance, knowing that even if you have memory slips, that is, even if you forget something mid-performance, you could get to the next spot, you could recover it quickly, or you could mitigate those memory slips altogether with some of these techniques. So one of the more obvious memorization techniques that comes to mind is blocking. So when I say blocking, I'm thinking of taking groups of notes and sort of minimizing them to a few chunks. So as opposed to thinking of an entire scale, thinking of the chunks of a scale where your thumb switches, or as opposed to thinking of every note in a harmonic progression, thinking about the progression itself and where your hand sits on the piano. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say you're working on Bach B-flat major prelude from Well-Tempered Clavier. It starts with this sort of toccata section. Goes into some scalar sections. If you're memorizing this right from the beginning, the first thing that I would do is separate it into the harmonic progression and block it into something more like this. Now, as long as you remember when the notes happen within that progression, in this case it's bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, then you can memorize it very quickly. Another great example is the D minor prelude from Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1. Sounds something like this. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. You'll end up blocking it down to something like this. You can block the left hand there too. It makes it more manageable for the brain. A final example that works really, really well in a lot of cases is the Chopin etude, the Ocean etude. the whole etude is an exercise in arpeggios, right? So if you broke that down into different blocks, different groups, you'd end up with just a few chords stacked on top of each other. There's a few ways to go about it. You could either block it into sections within one range of the piano, so right in one octave. Or you could go up and down the piano, the compass of the piano with the same chords stacked on top of each other, which is how the etude ends up working out when you perform it, like this. And again, as long as you know the order of the notes that they happen within that progression, you can quickly learn a whole section. You get the idea. One final really helpful time to use blocking is scales. So I'm thinking of when your thumb changes during a scale. So let's say, for example, you're doing C major. Your thumb will change onto F, and then again, back onto C. If you blocked those sections, you'd end up with something like this before working out the scale. See what I mean? A less obvious usage, or maybe a more specific usage, is this harmonic scale from the Chopin Heroic Polonaise. Right, so if you blocked this, you get the idea. You could do that with both hands, but usually it's more effective to do one hand at a time because your thumb's going to be crossing at different points. So that's the idea behind blocking, taking a ton of notes, a lot of information, and consolidating it down to small groups of information so that you can memorize a bit more of the roadmap and less of the individual points along the texture. I think the reason I can still play this fugue after however many years since I've studied it is because I used the exact same fingering every single time I practiced it. And this is maybe my biggest point during this video, is consistently using the same fingering. Fingering came up, I think, in the last video too. In this case, it's in a slightly different context. Normally at the piano, we have the pedal to our advantage, and we struggle memorizing contrapuntal music because we have this huge advantage that we can hold down the pedal, the piano continues to sound, and we can put our hands in the spot on the piano we want them to be to continue into the next section. The problem with that is you can do one specific section over and over and over again and use a different fingering every single time. Something that's been very helpful to me in this same vein of using the same fingering every time you work on an excerpt is bringing some organ technique over to the piano. Not entirely, they're totally different instruments, but using a fingering without pedal at the piano that lends itself to doing a certain articulation. In this case, the articulation I wanted for this fugue subject, granted a fugue written for the organ, was this. And I used a fingering that's going to let me do that articulation, the long, the short, the legato, staccato, where I want them, despite the fact that I don't have a sustain pedal on the organ. I brought that to the piano, and then I could add pedal. Why would I? It's a fugue written for the organ, but I could add pedal to this later. More of as an effect, as opposed to for the sake of memorization or for the sake of being able to play with the articulation you want. Fingering is a huge deal and helps you remember things for a very long time. So next I want to talk to you about something I call checkpoints, which are these spots in the music, again, where you use a specific fingering and you know exactly how that section starts. The reason we have these it's less about memorizing the music from the beginning, and it's more about assurance and confidence in performance that when memory starts to fall apart a little bit, you can sort of reset and go back to playing it the way you're used to. Let's say you have memorization checkpoints at the beginning of every phrase. It's great, and you want to be able to start at those phrases, especially when you're practicing, maybe practicing sections in a different order. The problem is, once you set those checkpoints at the beginnings of phrases and something goes wrong in the middle of a phrase, you either have to skip the phrase entirely or go back to the beginning of the phrase. So with that same idea of checkpoints, which maybe you're already familiar with, I'm going to extend that to putting checkpoints in unexpected spots in the music. Putting it right in the middle, being able to start right in the middle so that when the time comes, if something goes wrong in the middle of a phrase, you could reset right on the spot, as opposed to having to, again, skip the phrase or go back to the beginning of the phrase. I'm going to use a couple of my favorite Beethoven examples to show you what I mean when it comes to checkpoints, splitting the difference between the big checkpoints. You probably know the second movement of Pathetique Sonata. It goes like this. There's a big checkpoint, right? There's a spot where you'd think, I could start from there if somebody asked me to start on the spot. There was a lot of time and a lot of music that happened between the beginning and that major checkpoint. So if I were to set a checkpoint at about the halfway point, I think I would do this E flat major, dominant 7 here. Before moving to this F dominant 7. I'd set it there and I'd think about the exact fingers that I'm using at that section so that if everything goes terrible, I don't have to skip all the way to the repetition of the theme in A flat major or go all the way back to the beginning of the piece. So let's say here this E flat dominant 7. I'm going to use 1, 2, and 4 with my right hand, and I'm playing the upper half of the octave. I'm playing the upper octave of this E flat here with my thumb. And ascending chromatically before going back to A flat major in the first inversion. Let's say then something goes terrible from the beginning. I found my E flat dominant 7, and I didn't have to skip back to the beginning of the music go back to, or skip ahead to the next repetition of the theme. Another great example that I love is the C major piano concerto. Specifically this rondo, the third movement. I think it's the third movement. There's this section towards the middle, which is really exciting. It's one of my favorites. That's the end of that section. It happens 3 times. Let's say you needed a contingency in case you totally forget halfway through what comes at the end of that section, which is possible. There are 3 very similar but slightly different repetitions. Let's say then here, I want to remember this A minor sort of E major suspension here. I guess it's just an A6/4. So I'll go, so if something happens wrong from here, my brain can fix itself, land on that A minor 6/4, A minor 6/4, 6/4 cadence going to A minor, I should say. If something goes wrong, I don't have to skip all the way ahead or go all the way back to where I was. That's the whole idea behind these checkpoints in the middle of the big phrases. One final thing I want to say about this idea of checkpoints and blocking the piece into different chunks is once you've got these chunks, these big, manageable chunks, and you know what order they go in, you could either have a friend call them out to you at random, try playing a chunk from start to finish in isolation from the rest of the piece, or you could go from back to front. You could play them in exactly reverse order. You could do the odd ones, do every other chunk, and then do the opposite of that. Skip the first one or skip whichever one you started with. Do every other, all the ones that you missed when you just did the other skip, if you see what I mean. Randomizing which order you play the chunks in is a huge deal. It helps you compartmentalize things, and then let's say something goes wrong on stage. It's again a way that you can reset if a memory slip comes up. Thank you so much for watching this video, if you made it all the way to the end, or I guess if you just watched a little bit of it. I hope that some of these tips that I provided can help you out a little bit in your piano learning journey, whether you're beginner or you're in the later stages. If you know these techniques, you're probably a more advanced pianist, and maybe this was just a helpful reminder. If you're at the beginning, know that these are techniques that a lot of pianists use. Even the really big ones, really famous ones, the concert pianists, they use techniques just like these to keep everything in order when they're on stage. They're sort of universally used, and if I was the first one to introduce them to you, I guess I could say, welcome to the Piano Practicing Club, the Piano Memorization Club, or the Organ Memorization Club, and I hope that these techniques help you a lot in your future, in your practice, in your performance, everything. I'm going to use a couple of my really favorite, hold on. I'm going to use you, can I use you?